Have you ever lied just to escape an embarrassing moment? What if that lie changed the course of your entire life? Subscribe to our channel. We're back with a full volume, and we'll surprise you with this and other stories. In this story, it all begins with an impulsive gesture, but what seemed like just an act ends up revealing secrets, jealousy, and an unexpected fate. Stay until the end, because the final scene will leave you speechless. The cobblestones of Bath gleamed wet under the morning drizzle as Margaret Taylor hurried down the familiar streets, her sensible shoes clicking against the stone with anxious precision. At 33, she had mastered the art of blending into crowds, of finding the quietest corners in every room, of existing without causing ripples. But today, her phone buzzed with the kind of summons that made her stomach clench. "Margaret, darling, we're having brunch at the Copper Kettle. And please don't come alone again. It's embarrassing." Lady Evelyn's voice carried through the speaker with that particular brand of maternal disappointment that could slice through steel. Margaret closed her eyes, took a steadying breath, and pushed open the cafe door. The Copper Kettle wrapped around her like a warm hug, all exposed brick walls, mismatched chairs, and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and buttery pastries. She ordered a cappuccino and surveyed the room for the most inconspicuous table, settling into a corner spot with her back to the wall. A well-worn copy of Persuasion emerged from her bag, her armor against the world. The familiar words of Jane Austen had barely begun to work their magic when the cafe door chimed again. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Through the window, she could see Lady Evelyn approaching with her usual entourage. 3 women who treated social events like military campaigns, their hats positioned at identical angles, their expressions uniformly judgmental. Panic rose in her throat like bile. She needed to leave, now. But as she gathered her things, her mother's eyes found hers through the glass. There was no escape. That's when she saw him. At the table beside hers sat a man who looked like he'd stepped from the pages of a period drama. Tall, with dark hair that looked effortlessly tousled, wearing a charcoal suit that fit him like it had been tailored specifically for his frame. A newspaper lay folded beside his teacup, and he held himself with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. Without thinking, without planning, without any regard for sanity or consequence, Margaret raised her hand and called out in a voice that trembled only slightly, "Oliver, darling, over here." The man looked up, confusion flickering across his angular features. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached his table, leaning down to whisper urgently, "Please, just for today, pretend you're my boyfriend." For a moment that stretched like eternity, he studied her face. Then his lips curved into a smile that was equal parts amused and intrigued. He stood with fluid grace, extending his hand. "Of course, darling. Sorry I'm late." And just like that, Margaret Taylor's perfectly ordered, predictably quiet life took its first step toward beautiful chaos. Chapter 2. An unusual agreement. Oliver Blake had encountered many unexpected situations during his 35 years, but being conscripted as a stranger's fake boyfriend in a Bath cafe was decidedly a first. Yet as Lady Evelyn swept through the Copper Kettle like a ship in full sail, her entourage trailing behind her with military precision, he found himself oddly charmed by the desperate woman beside him. "Mother," Margaret said, her voice carefully modulated despite the panic still flickering in her eyes, "I'd like you to meet Oliver Blake. Oliver, this is my mother, Lady Evelyn." Oliver rose smoothly, extending his hand with practiced ease. Years of client meetings and London social functions had taught him the art of first impressions, and he deployed every weapon in his arsenal now. "Lady Evelyn, what a pleasure. Margaret speaks of you often." The older woman's eyebrows rose fractionally as she assessed him with the thoroughness of a customs inspector. Her companions, Mrs. Pemberton, Lady Hertford, and the formidable Mrs. Ashworth arranged themselves around the table like a tribunal. "And what is it you do, Mr. Blake?" Lady Evelyn inquired, settling into her chair with the air of someone preparing for a lengthy interrogation. "Architecture," Oliver replied, grateful for solid ground. "I've recently relocated from London to Bath. There's something about this city's bones that speaks to the soul, don't you think? The way the Georgian terraces embrace the natural curves of the hills." Margaret blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected philosophical musings on urban planning from her hastily recruited co-conspirator. "How wonderfully artistic," Mrs. Pemberton cooed, though her tone suggested she found artists only marginally more acceptable than street performers. "And how did you two meet?" Lady Evelyn's question hung in the air, like a trap waiting to spring. Margaret's cappuccino cup rattled against its saucer. Oliver's hand moved almost imperceptibly to steady it, the gesture so natural it might have been rehearsed. "The rare books section at the library," he said without missing a beat. "We were both reaching for the same first edition of Wuthering Heights. I'm afraid I lost the battle, but won something far more valuable, the chance to buy this remarkable woman coffee." The women at the table exchanged glances. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, not entirely from embarrassment. For the next 20 minutes, Oliver charmed her mother's circle with effortless grace. He discussed Bath's architecture, recommended restaurants, and even managed to make Mrs. Ashworth laugh, a feat Margaret had previously thought impossible. When the ordeal finally ended, and the formidable quartet departed in a flurry of air kisses and promises to "see you both again soon," Margaret slumped in her chair. "I am so sorry," she began, her words tumbling over each other. "I don't know what came over me. I just couldn't face another lecture about how I'm wasting my life being single, and you were there, and you looked reliable." Oliver laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "Reliable?" I'm not sure whether to be flattered or insulted. "Flattered, definitely flattered." Margaret managed a shaky smile. "Thank you. You were brilliant. I don't know how to repay you." Oliver studied her face for a moment, noting the way the stress had left her features and how her smile transformed her entire appearance. "Actually," he said, his tone deliberately casual, "I might need a favor myself sometime. New in town and all that. Perhaps we could call it even?" Margaret nodded eagerly, not yet understanding that she'd just agreed to the most complicated arrangement of her life. Chapter 3. The Second Encounter. 3 days after the cafe incident, Margaret's phone rang at precisely 9 a.m. She didn't need to look at the screen to know it was her mother. Lady Evelyn's calls arrived with the punctuality of Big Ben. "Margaret, darling, I've had the most wonderful idea. The Bath Heritage Society is hosting its annual charity tea this Saturday. You and Oliver simply must come. Mrs. Ashworth is bringing her nephew from London, and I thought it would be lovely for you both to meet other young professionals in the area." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "Mother, I'm not sure." "Nonsense! Oliver seems like such a cultured young man. I've already told everyone about him. 3 o'clock sharp at the assembly rooms. Do try to wear something that isn't brown, dear." The line went dead, leaving Margaret staring at her reflection in the library's ancient windows. Around her, the rare book section hummed with scholarly silence, but her mind raced with panic. How could she possibly find Oliver again? She didn't even know his surname, and charming architect from London was hardly enough information to track someone down in Bath. Fate, however, had other plans. At lunch, Margaret found herself walking past the construction site near the Royal Crescent, where a small crowd had gathered around an elegant man in a hard hat who was explaining something about Georgian stonework to a group of tourists. Even at 50 yards, she recognized those shoulders. "Oliver!" she called out before her courage could desert her. He turned, and his face broke into that same bemused smile that had saved her in the cafe. After dismissing the tour group with practiced charm, he approached her with measured steps. "Margaret, what a pleasant surprise, though you look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse." I've seen my future." She took a shaky breath. "My mother has invited us to a charity tea this Saturday at the Assembly Rooms, and I may have let her believe that you and I are more serious than we actually are, which is to say, at all serious, because we're not serious. We're not even real." Oliver removed his hard hat, running a hand through his hair. "Let me see if I understand. You need me to continue our charade. Just once more, I promise. After that, we can stage a civilized breakup. You can move to Scotland or develop a gambling addiction. Whatever works best for your schedule." His laugh was warm and unexpected. Scotland does sound appealing this time of year. He paused, studying her anxious expression. "But if I'm going to be your fake boyfriend again, I have conditions." Margaret's heart sank. "Of course. How much do you want? I don't have much, but not money." He held up a hand. "Books. You work in the rare books section, don't you? I'm researching Bath's architectural history for a project. Access to your collection would be infinitely more valuable than cash." "Books?" Margaret blinked. "You want books?" "Knowledge is the only currency that appreciates over time," Oliver said with a slight smile. "Besides, if I'm going to be your boyfriend, even a fictional one, I should probably know what makes you tick. And something tells me the answer to that question lives in those rare books of yours." Margaret found herself smiling, despite her anxiety. "You want to understand me through Victorian poetry and medieval manuscripts? I've found that people choose their books as carefully as they choose their friends, sometimes more carefully." "All right," she agreed, extending her hand. "Partners in crime?" Oliver took her hand, and for a moment that lasted slightly too long, neither of them moved to let go. "Partners in crime," he confirmed. "Though I suspect this particular crime might prove more complicated than either of us anticipates." Chapter 4. Pieces that Fit. The Assembly Rooms buzzed with the genteel chaos of Bath society at its finest. Margaret smoothed her navy blue dress, not brown as specifically requested, and surveyed the crowd of precisely dressed people balancing teacups and social expectations with equal care. "You look terrified," Oliver observed, appearing at her elbow with 2 cups of Earl Grey and his usual air of unflappable calm. "I hate these events," Margaret admitted, accepting the tea gratefully. "All this forced conversation and pretending to care about who's renovating their conservatory or whose daughter got into Cambridge. I always feel like I'm performing in a play where everyone else knows the script except me." Oliver's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's remarkably honest. Most people pretend to love these things. Most people are better at pretending than I am. Present company excluded, of course. You're alarmingly good at this." "Years of practice," he said, but something in his tone suggested the story behind that skill wasn't entirely pleasant. "Though I must admit, having a co-conspirator makes it considerably more bearable." Their conversation was interrupted by Lady Evelyn's approach, arm-linked with a severe-looking woman Margaret didn't recognize. "Mrs. Worthington, I'd like you to meet my daughter Margaret and her young man, Oliver Blake." "Oliver is an architect, just moved here from London. Isn't that fascinating?" Mrs. Worthington assessed Oliver with the intensity of an art dealer evaluating a potential forgery. "Architecture? How practical. And what drew you to Bath, Mr. Blake?" "The same thing that drew John Wood the Elder in the 18th century," Oliver replied smoothly. "The perfect marriage of natural beauty and human ambition. Bath is a love letter written in limestone." Margaret nearly choked on her tea. Mrs. Worthington, however, looked genuinely impressed. "How poetic! And Margaret, dear, how wonderful that you found someone who appreciates culture. Your mother tells me you work at the library." "The rare books collection," Margaret confirmed, bracing herself for the usual dismissive response. "How marvellous! I've been searching everywhere for information about Bath's medieval manuscripts. You must know about the illuminated Psalter from the old abbey." Margaret's face lit up. "The Psalter of Bath? It's one of my favourite pieces. The gold leaf work in the margins is extraordinary. Most people don't realise—" For the next 10 minutes, Margaret and Mrs. Worthington discussed medieval manuscripts with the enthusiasm of sports fans debating their favorite teams. Oliver watched, fascinated by the transformation. The nervous, apologetic woman from the cafe had vanished, replaced by someone passionate and knowledgeable. "You're brilliant," he said quietly, when Mrs. Worthington finally moved on to terrorize other guests. Margaret flushed. She was just being polite. She was being genuine. There's a difference. Oliver's gaze held hers. "You know an extraordinary amount about medieval art." "It's just my job." "No, it's not just your job, it's your passion. I can hear it in your voice." They were interrupted again, this time by a young man with an eager expression and an expensive haircut. "Oliver Blake. Good God, I thought that was you. James Whitmore, we worked together on the Kensington project 3 years ago." Oliver's expression shifted subtly, becoming more guarded. "James, what brings you to Bath?" "Aunt lives here. Dragged me along to this delightful torture session." James's eyes shifted to Margaret with obvious curiosity. "And who's this lovely creature?" "Margaret Taylor," Oliver said, his hand moving instinctively to the small of her back. "My girlfriend." The possessive note in his voice surprised them both. Margaret felt a flutter of something warm and dangerous in her chest. "Lucky man," James said, raising his teacup in a mock toast. "Though I must say, I'm surprised to see you've settled down. Last I heard, you were swearing off serious relationships after—" He stopped abruptly, apparently reading something in Oliver's expression. "People change," Oliver said quietly. Later, as they walked back through Bath's lamplit streets, Margaret gathered her courage. What did he mean about swearing off relationships? Oliver was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "I was engaged. It ended badly. I decided complicated was better avoided. And yet here you are, fake dating a stranger." "Yes," he agreed, his smile rueful. "Apparently I'm not as good at avoiding complicated as I thought." Chapter 5. Hidden Truths. The rare books room in Bath's Central Library felt like a sanctuary carved from time itself. Leather-bound volumes lined the walls, their spines catching the afternoon light that filtered through tall windows. Margaret moved between the shelves with practiced reverence, pulling volumes for Oliver's research while he sat at the oak reading table, making notes in a leather notebook. "This is extraordinary," Oliver said, carefully turning the pages of a 1750 architectural survey. "I had no idea such detailed records existed." "Most people don't." Margaret set another stack of books beside him. "That's what I love about this work, being the bridge between past and present. These books are conversations across centuries, waiting for the right person to listen." Oliver looked up from his notes, struck by the passion in her voice. "Is that why you became a librarian?" Margaret settled into the chair across from him, suddenly self-conscious. "That makes it sound more noble than it is. Honestly, I became a librarian because books don't judge you. They don't care if you're not married at 33, or if you wear the same 3 dresses to every social event, or if you'd rather spend Saturday night with Jane Austen than at a dinner party. And people do judge you for those things. My mother's friends certainly do. My mother certainly does." Margaret traced the grain of the oak table with her finger. "Lady Evelyn had me when she was 19. By the time she was my age, she'd been married 15 years and had produced 2 children who actually met her expectations." "2 children?" "My brother James lives in Australia. He's a surgeon, married to another surgeon, with 2 perfect children who play violin and speak Mandarin." Margaret's smile was tinged with sadness. "He calls on Christmas and sends photos of his family skiing in the Alps. Very dutiful, very distant." Oliver set down his pen, giving her his full attention. "And you're the disappointing daughter who chose books over babies?" "I'm the daughter who chose solitude over settling. At least, that's how she sees it." Margaret looked around the quiet room. "I used to think she was right, that there was something fundamentally wrong with me for preferring this to normal life." "Define normal." "You know, Marriage, children, dinner parties, where you discuss school fees and holiday plans. A life that looks like everyone else's life. Oliver was quiet for a moment, considering her words. My ex-fiancée used to say the same thing, that I was too attached to my work, too comfortable being alone. She wanted me to want the things she wanted, house in Surrey, weekend parties, children before 35. What happened? I discovered that wanting something because someone else wants you to want it is a recipe for misery. His voice carried a weight that spoke of hard-learned wisdom. Harriet was brilliant, beautiful, everything I was supposed to want, but I felt like I was playing a role in her vision of what our life should be, not building something authentic. Margaret felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy at the mention of Harriet's beauty. How long were you together? 3 years. Engaged for 6 months. Oliver's fingers drummed against the table. The end came when I realized I was happier alone on construction sites than I was in the flat we shared. She deserved someone who lit up when she walked into a room, not someone who felt relief when she left. That must have been incredibly painful. The painful part wasn't ending it. The painful part was realizing how long I'd been lying to myself about what I wanted. He met her eyes. What about you? Has there been anyone serious? Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. Define serious. I've had relationships, but they all followed the same pattern. Nice men who thought I had potential to be different than I am. They'd suggest I could be more social, more adventurous, more. Eventually, they'd find someone who didn't need improving. Perhaps the problem wasn't that you needed improving, Oliver said quietly. Perhaps the problem was that they needed someone different from who you actually are. The words hung between them like a revelation. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. Is that what we're doing? She asked suddenly, pretending to be different from who we are. Oliver considered the question seriously. I don't think so. When I'm with you, I don't feel like I'm performing. Do you? Margaret realized with a start of surprise that she didn't. No. Even when we're lying to everyone else, it doesn't feel like lying when we're talking to each other. That, Oliver said, might be the most honest thing either of us has said in years. Chapter 6. The Dance of Pretending. The Guildhall's main ballroom gleamed under crystal chandeliers, its Georgian splendor providing the perfect backdrop for Bath's annual Heritage Gala. Margaret stood at the edge of the dance floor, watching couples glide across the polished wood with the fluid grace of people born to waltz. You look like you're contemplating flight, Oliver observed, appearing beside her with 2 glasses of champagne. I don't dance, Margaret said firmly, accepting the glass with grateful hands. I tried lessons when I was 12. The instructor told my mother I had the natural rhythm of a telegraph pole. Harsh but oddly specific, Oliver said, his mouth quirking upward, though I suspect the instructor lacked imagination. Are you about to tell me that dancing is just another form of architecture, movement in 3-dimensional space? Actually, yes, though I was going to say it's more like reading. You follow the narrative, trust the structure, and let yourself get swept along. Before Margaret could protest further, the band struck up a slow waltz. Oliver set down both their glasses and extended his hand with a slight bow. I don't think this is necessary for our performance, Margaret said, eyeing his outstretched palm nervously. No one's watching us. Your mother is watching us. Mrs. Ashworth is watching us, and James Whitmore is definitely watching us, along with half the room. Oliver's voice was gentle but insistent. Besides, when was the last time you did something you thought you couldn't do? There's usually a good reason I don't do things I can't do, such as public humiliation, bruised toes, the collapse of Western civilization. Oliver laughed, a rich sound that drew smiles from nearby couples. I promise to take full responsibility for any civilizational collapse that results from our dancing. Despite every rational instinct screaming warnings, Margaret found herself placing her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with surprising warmth. and she felt the gentle pressure of his other hand settling at her waist. "The trick," Oliver murmured as he guided her onto the dance floor, "is to stop thinking and start feeling the music." "I don't feel music," Margaret whispered back, hyper-aware of the other couples around them. "I analyze it. I categorize it. I wonder about the composer's intentions and the historical context of the performance." "Of course you do." His smile was fond rather than mocking. "But just for 3 minutes. Could you try being a woman dancing with a man instead of a scholar examining a cultural phenomenon?" The first steps were hesitant, clumsy. Margaret was acutely conscious of her feet, her posture, the way her dress moved with each turn. But gradually, as Oliver led her through the basic patterns with patient confidence, something shifted. The room seemed to fade around them until there was only the music, the gentle pressure of his hand guiding her, and the surprising discovery that her body knew how to follow his lead. "You're thinking too hard again," Oliver said softly, pulling her slightly closer. "I'm thinking that this is dangerous," Margaret replied, but she didn't pull away. "Dangerous how?" "Because it feels—" She struggled for the right word. "Real." Something flickered in Oliver's expression. Surprise, recognition, perhaps a touch of panic. "Margaret, I know it's not real. I know we're just pretending." The words tumbled out in a rush. "But for a moment there, I forgot that we were acting." They had stopped moving, standing still in the center of the dance floor, while other couples flowed around them like water around stones. Oliver's hand was still at her waist, their faces closer than they had ever been. "What if—" Oliver began, then stopped himself. "What if what?" "Nothing. It's not. This isn't—" He stepped back abruptly, breaking the spell. "We should get some air. It's rather warm in here." The terrace outside the ballroom was cooler, with a view of Bath's twinkling lights spread below like scattered stars. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the absence of Oliver's warmth like a physical ache. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment. "I didn't mean to make things awkward." "You didn't make anything awkward." Oliver's voice was tight with some emotion she couldn't name. "I did. By being kind, by making me feel like I might actually be capable of grace, by forgetting for a moment that this is temporary." He turned to face her, and in the moonlight his expression was painfully honest. "By letting myself imagine what it might be like if this were real." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs, every rational thought in her head at war with the desperate hope blooming in her chest. "Oliver, I should take you home," he said quickly. "It's getting late, and we both have work tomorrow." The moment shattered like glass. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice, and they walked back through the ballroom in silence, their careful charade intact, but something fundamental between them irrevocably changed. Chapter 7. True Feelings. Margaret hadn't slept well since the gala 3 nights ago. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself back in Oliver's arms, feeling the warmth of his hand at her waist and the dangerous possibility that had flickered between them before reality reasserted itself. She threw herself into her work with unusual intensity, staying late to catalogue a new acquisition of Victorian letters, anything to keep her mind occupied. The library's evening silence was broken by a soft knock on the rare books room door. Margaret's heart jumped, but when she looked up it was only Mrs. Patterson, the evening security guard. "Begging your pardon, Miss Taylor, but there's a gentleman here to see you. Says his name is Oliver Blake." Margaret's pulse quickened. "It's all right, Mrs. Patterson. He's researching architectural history." She found Oliver in the main entrance, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. He looked like a man wrestling with decisions he didn't want to make. "I brought your book back," he said without preamble, pulling a volume from his coat. "The Architectural Survey. Thank you for letting me borrow it." Margaret accepted the book, noting that his fingers carefully avoided touching hers. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "Some of it." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Margaret, we need to talk about what happened at the gala." "Nothing happened at the gala," she said quickly. "We danced. People saw us together. It was exactly what we planned." "Was it?" His eyes searched her face. "Because it didn't feel planned to me. It felt real," she finished softly. "I know. I felt it too." The admission hung between them like a confession. Oliver ran a hand through his hair, disrupting its careful styling. "This is exactly what I was trying to avoid," he said, more to himself than to her. "Complicated. Messy. Feelings that make everything impossible." "Impossible how?" Margaret's voice was steadier than she felt. "We're both adults. We both feel something. What's impossible about that?" "Because I'm not good at this." The words came out harsher than he'd intended. "I tried being good at relationships, at making someone happy, at being what another person needed. I failed spectacularly. Harriet deserved better than what I could give her, and so do you. Don't you think I should be the judge of what I deserve?" Oliver's laugh was bitter. "You think you want someone like me, but you don't. You want the version of me that exists when we're pretending. The charming, attentive boyfriend who says the right things and makes you feel special at dinner parties. But that's not who I am when the performance ends." "Who are you when the performance ends?" Margaret asked quietly. "Someone who works 16-hour days because he loves buildings more than people. Someone who forgets to eat dinner when he's absorbed in a project. Someone who can go days without meaningful human conversation and not miss it." His voice grew softer, more vulnerable. "Someone who's better at being alone." Margaret studied his face, noting the shadows under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. "And you think that makes you unsuitable for anything real?" "I think it makes me unsuitable for you. You deserve someone who wants to build a life with another person, not someone who spent years perfecting the art of solitude. What if I told you that I understand solitude, that I've spent most of my adult life preferring books to people, work to social obligations, quiet evenings to parties?" Margaret stepped closer, forcing him to meet her eyes. "What if I told you that the reason I felt so comfortable pretending with you is because I didn't have to pretend to be someone more social, more outgoing, more normal?" Something shifted in Oliver's expression. "Margaret, I'm not asking you to change," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I'm not asking you to want things you don't want or be someone you're not. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that maybe we could be ourselves together instead of being ourselves alone." For a moment, hope flickered across his features. Then his walls slammed back into place. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because what if we try and it doesn't work? What if I disappoint you the way I disappointed Harriet? What if you realize that the real me isn't worth the fantasy we've created?" His voice cracked slightly on the last words. Margaret felt her heart breaking for him, for the fear that had convinced him he was unlovable in his authentic form. "Then we'll have tried," she said simply, "and we'll know. But if we don't try, we'll spend the rest of our lives wondering what if." Oliver was quiet for a long moment, staring at the library's marble floor. When he looked up, his expression was resolved, but pained. "I can't, Margaret. I'm sorry, but I can't take that risk again, with you or with anyone." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Margaret standing alone in the vast, echoing space, surrounded by thousands of love stories, but unable to write her own. Chapter 8. The Ex-Fiancé. Margaret threw herself into the mundane routine of Saturday errands, hoping that the familiar rhythm of market stalls and shop queues would quiet the chaos in her mind. 3 days had passed since Oliver's rejection in the library, and she'd managed to convince herself that she was handling it with admirable maturity. She was not pining. She was not replaying their conversation. She was certainly not scanning every crowd for a glimpse of dark hair and broad shoulders. which made it all the more devastating when she spotted him outside the antique bookshop on Bartlett Street. He wasn't alone. The woman beside him was everything Margaret had feared Harriet would be. Tall, elegant, with the kind of effortless sophistication that came from good breeding and better genetics. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and she wore a cream cashmere coat that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly salary. She was beautiful in the way that made other women instinctively check their reflection and find themselves wanting. But it wasn't Harriet's beauty that made Margaret's chest tighten with something painful and primitive. It was the way Oliver was looking at her, the way he leaned in slightly when she spoke, the almost unconscious tilt of his body toward hers. It was the intimacy of two people who had shared a life, who knew each other's rhythms and secrets. Margaret pressed herself against the window of the neighboring shop, praying they wouldn't notice her. She watched as Harriet placed a manicured hand on Oliver's arm, gesturing towards something in the bookshop window. He nodded, said something that made her laugh, a silvery sound that carried across the street like wind chimes. They looked perfect together, like they belonged in the same world, spoke the same language of privilege and possibility that Margaret had never quite mastered. Seeing them together made her acutely aware of every inadequacy she'd spent her life trying to ignore: her second-hand clothes, her social awkwardness, her stubborn attachment to dusty books and quiet corners. The conversation continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Margaret caught fragments: London, the firm, remember when. Each word felt like evidence of a shared history she could never compete with, a connection that made their brief pretense seem laughably insignificant. When Harriet rose on her toes to kiss Oliver's cheek goodbye, Margaret felt something inside her break cleanly in half. It was a casual gesture, familiar and fond, but it spoke of intimacy earned over years, not days, of real history, not fabricated meet-cutes in coffee shops. Oliver's face was unreadable as he watched Harriet walk away, but he didn't move immediately. He stood there for a long moment, hands in his pockets, staring after her with an expression Margaret couldn't decipher from her hiding spot. The rational part of her mind, the part that had spent years protecting her from exactly this kind of pain, whispered that she should be grateful. This confirmed what Oliver had tried to tell her, that whatever had flickered between them was temporary, insubstantial, a brief deviation from the real relationships that shaped people's lives. She should thank him for his honesty, for saving her from the humiliation of believing their pretense could become something lasting. But the rational part of her mind was drowned out by a voice she rarely acknowledged, the one that had hoped, despite every lesson experience had taught her, that she might finally be someone's first choice, instead of their consolation prize. Margaret waited until Oliver disappeared around the corner before emerging from her hiding spot. Her reflection in the shop window looked exactly as pathetic as she felt. A woman in her 30s, clutching a canvas bag of groceries, watching other people's love stories from the sidelines. She walked home through Bath's winding streets, each step feeling heavier than the last. The city's Georgian elegance, which usually comforted her with its permanence and grace, now seemed to mock her smallness. She was a minor character in other people's stories, a bit player who had briefly wandered into the spotlight before remembering her proper place. By the time she reached her flat, Margaret had made a decision. She would tell her mother that Oliver had ended things, a mutual decision, very civilized. These things sometimes don't work out. She would return to her books, her solitude, her carefully constructed life that asked nothing of her except competence and caused no one disappointment. It was better this way, safer. She had survived 33 years without needing anyone's validation or love. She could survive the rest. But as she sat in her kitchen, staring at the phone that never rang with calls from friends or lovers, Margaret couldn't shake the image of Oliver's face as he watched Harriet walk away. There had been something in his expression, Not longing exactly, but a kind of resigned sadness that she recognized because she saw it in her own mirror every morning. Perhaps they were both just people who had learned to expect disappointment, who protected themselves by walking away before anyone else could leave first. Chapter 9. Silent Goodbye. Margaret stared at the email on her computer screen for the 5th time that morning, the words blurring together like watercolors in rain. The University of Edinburgh was offering her a position in their rare manuscripts department, a dream job she'd applied for months ago, back when her life felt predictable and small, and she'd thought expanding her horizons might cure the restless dissatisfaction that plagued her quiet evenings. Now, the opportunity felt less like a dream and more like salvation. "Dr. Morrison will want an answer by Friday," she murmured to herself, cursor hovering over the reply button. Edinburgh was far enough from Bath to make weekend visits impossible, far enough to start over completely, far enough to forget she'd ever been foolish enough to believe a kind stranger's performance might become something real. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Darling, Mrs. Ashworth is having her garden party next Sunday. She specifically asked about bringing Oliver. What shall I tell her?" Margaret closed her eyes and typed back, "Tell her we've ended things." "It wasn't working out." The response came immediately. "Oh, darling, I'm so sorry. These things happen. You're still young." Young, at 33, with a growing certainty that she was fundamentally unsuited for the kind of life other people seemed to navigate so effortlessly. Margaret deleted her mother's message and opened a new email to Dr. Morrison. "Dear Dr. Morrison, I am delighted to accept the position." The words came surprisingly easily. Yes, she could start within the month. Yes, she understood the teaching responsibilities. Yes, she was excited about the research opportunities. Each sentence built a wall between her current life and whatever came next, and she found the construction oddly soothing. She was so absorbed in crafting her professional enthusiasm that she almost missed the soft knock on the rare books room door. Margaret looked up to find Oliver standing in the doorway, and her heart performed the same painful leap it had been executing every time she glimpsed him across Bath streets over the past week. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said formally, as if they were strangers again. "I wanted to return the rest of the books I borrowed." He approached her desk with careful steps, placing a small stack of volumes beside her keyboard. His hands, she noticed, weren't quite steady. "Thank you," Margaret replied, matching his neutral tone. "I trust they were helpful for your research." "Very much so." He paused, seeming to wrestle with words. "Margaret, about last week." "Please don't." She held up a hand, surprising them both with the firmness in her voice. "You were right. This arrangement had run its course. It's better to end things clearly rather than let them drag on awkwardly." Oliver's expression flickered with something that might have been hurt. "I see. I've actually accepted a position in Edinburgh," Margaret continued, proud of how steady her voice remained. "I'll be leaving Bath at the end of the month." The silence that followed was deafening. Oliver went very still, his face carefully blank in a way that reminded her painfully of their first meeting in the cafe. Polite, distant, performative. "Edinburgh," he repeated finally. That's wonderful. A new beginning." "Yes, exactly what I need." They stood there for a moment, surrounded by centuries of recorded human emotion, neither able to access the words that might bridge the growing chasm between them. "Well," Oliver said at last, "I should let you get back to work. I'm sure you have a great deal to organize before the move." "Yes, quite a lot." He turned to leave, then stopped at the doorway. "Margaret?" Her heart clenched with hope she immediately tried to suppress. "Yes?" "I hope Edinburgh brings you everything you're looking for." After he left, Margaret sat in the quiet room for a very long time, staring at the books he'd returned. One had a piece of paper marking a page, not a bookmark, just a torn corner of notebook paper. She opened the volume and found herself looking at a photograph of Bath Abbey's medieval stonework. In the margin, in Oliver's precise handwriting, was a single line. Beauty in unexpected places. M would understand this better than anyone. O. Margaret closed the book carefully and placed it with the others. Then she returned to her computer and finished her acceptance letter to Edinburgh. Each word a small act of self-preservation disguised as professional ambition. Outside her window, Bath's ancient stones caught the afternoon light, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in their shadow. The city would endure long after she was gone, its stories written in limestone and memories, in the spaces between what people said and what they meant. By evening, she had submitted her resignation letter to the Bath Library, confirmed her Edinburgh start date, and begun the methodical process of dismantling the life she'd built in a city that now held too many dangerous possibilities. It was, she told herself, the rational thing to do. Chapter 10. The Letter. Moving day arrived with characteristic English rain, not the dramatic downpour that might have felt appropriately pathetic, but a persistent drizzle that made everything grey and damp and quietly miserable. Margaret's belongings filled exactly 3 boxes and 2 suitcases, a testament to a life lived carefully within manageable parameters. She had one final errand before catching the afternoon train to Edinburgh, returning a stack of personal books she'd accidentally packed with the library's collection. The ancient bookshop on Bartlett Street, the same one where she'd witnessed Oliver's reunion with Harriet, had agreed to take them as a donation. The shop smelled of aged paper and possibility, its narrow aisles crowded with literary treasures waiting for the right reader. Margaret was explaining the donation to the proprietor when he disappeared into the back room and emerged with an envelope. "Nearly forgot," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "A gentleman left this for you yesterday. Said you'd be coming by today. Quite insistent about it, actually." Margaret's name was written across the cream-coloured envelope in Oliver's distinctive handwriting. Her heart performed a complicated rhythm against her ribs as she accepted it with fingers that trembled only slightly. "Did he say anything else?" "Only that it was important you read it before you left town." The proprietor studied her with the sharp interest of someone who'd spent decades reading between the lines of human behavior. Seemed rather earnest about the whole thing. Margaret tucked the letter into her coat pocket, where it seemed to burn against her side during the walk back to her flat. She sat on the bare floor of her empty living room, surrounded by the ghost marks where furniture had once stood, and stared at the envelope for a full 5 minutes before finding the courage to open it. The letter was 3 pages long, written on heavy paper in Oliver's careful script. "Margaret, I've started this letter a dozen times, and every attempt has felt inadequate to the magnitude of what I need to say to you. I suspect that's because I'm trying to compress 3 years of learned caution and 35 years of self-protection into words that might make sense to someone who deserves far better than my cowardice. I lied to you. Not about the facts. Those were all true. I was engaged to Harriet. It did end badly, and I did decide that solitude was safer than the alternative. But I lied about why I couldn't take the risk of something real with you. The truth is that from the moment you pointed at me in that cafe and asked me to pretend to be your boyfriend, I haven't been pretending nearly as much as I claimed. Every conversation we shared, every moment of understanding that passed between us, every laugh we stole from your mother's expectations, those were real. More real than anything I experienced in 3 years with Harriet. When you asked me to consider the possibility that we could be ourselves together instead of being ourselves alone, you offered me something I'd convinced myself I didn't want. A partnership based on acceptance rather than improvement, compatibility rather than compromise. The reason I couldn't accept wasn't because I didn't want it. It was because I wanted it so desperately it terrified me. You see, with Harriet, I always knew I was failing to be what she needed. There was a strange comfort in that failure. It confirmed what I'd always suspected about my unsuitability for domestic happiness. But with you, I glimpsed the possibility that I might actually be enough, exactly as I am. And that possibility felt infinitely more dangerous than guaranteed disappointment. I saw you last Saturday, outside the bookshop. You looked stricken, and I realized you'd seen me talking to Harriet. I should have come after you immediately, but I was paralyzed by the certainty that you'd misunderstood everything you witnessed. Harriet came to Bath to return some books I'd left in London and to tell me she's engaged to someone else, someone who, in her words, lights up when I enter a room. I was happy for her, genuinely happy, because she deserves that kind of love. But mostly, I felt relief that she'd found what we both knew I couldn't give her. After she left, I stood on that street corner, thinking about the different kinds of love there are in this world. There's the love that tries to reshape people into better versions of themselves, and there's the love that sees people clearly and chooses them anyway. I spent 3 years in the first kind and ran away from the possibility of the second. But I don't want to run anymore, Margaret. I want to risk disappointment for the chance of something extraordinary. I want to build something real with someone who understands that love doesn't require constant performance, that some of the best conversations happen in quiet rooms surrounded by books, that two people can be gloriously, contentedly alone together. I know I have no right to ask you to reconsider Edinburgh. You're moving toward a life that will appreciate your brilliance, your passion, your remarkable ability to bridge centuries with your understanding of human stories. But if there's any part of you that might be willing to build a new story here, with me, without pretending to be anyone other than who we actually are, if there's still space in your story for me, I'll be at the Copper Kettle every afternoon at 3 until you leave. Not because I expect you to come, but because I need you to know that I'm willing to wait, to hope, to risk everything I've spent years protecting myself from. Yours, if you'll have me, Oliver. P.S. I finally understand what you meant about books being conversations across time. This letter is my conversation with you, across the space between fear and hope. Please know that whatever you decide, knowing you has made me braver than I thought possible. Margaret read the letter twice, then a third time, her vision blurring with tears she'd been holding back for weeks. Outside her window, the rain had stopped, and pale afternoon sunlight was breaking through the clouds, casting everything in soft, forgiving light. She looked at her watch. It was 2:45 p.m. The train station was in one direction, the Copper Kettle in the other. Edinburgh represented safety, a fresh start, the comfortable certainty of solitude. The cafe represented the most terrifying possibility of all, that love might not require her to be anyone other than exactly who she was. Margaret stood up, brushed the dust from her clothes and picked up her suitcase. Then she made the most important decision of her carefully constructed life. Chapter 11. The train to the north. Margaret sat in the train carriage, watching Bath's familiar spires disappear behind the grey English countryside. Her suitcase rested in the overhead compartment, her ticket to Edinburgh tucked safely in her purse, and Oliver's letter folded carefully in her coat pocket, where she'd read it 3 more times since leaving her flat. The sensible choice, she told herself. The safe choice. Edinburgh offered everything she'd thought she wanted: professional respect, intellectual stimulation, a chance to start over without the complicated emotional baggage that seemed to follow her through Bath's narrow streets. She'd made the right decision by choosing certainty over the terrifying possibility of heartbreak. But as the train pulled away from Bath Spa Station, Margaret found herself thinking about stories, not the medieval manuscripts and historical documents that had been her life's work, but the stories people told themselves about who they were and what they deserved. For 33 years, she'd been writing herself as a supporting character in other people's narratives. The dutiful daughter who never quite measured up, the reliable colleague who kept the library running smoothly, the woman who watched from the sidelines while others found love, built families, created lives that seemed to matter in ways hers never had. Even with Oliver, she'd initially cast herself as the desperate woman who needed rescuing from social embarrassment, grateful for whatever scraps of attention a handsome stranger might offer. It had taken weeks for her to realize that he'd never seen her that way, that from their first conversation he'd treated her as an equal, someone worthy of genuine interest and respect. The train conductor announced they'd be arriving in Bristol in 20 minutes. Margaret stared out the window at the rolling hills and hedgerows, thinking about the line in Oliver's letter that had lodged itself in her heart like a splinter. "If there's still space in your story for me." What if she'd been writing the wrong story all along? What if instead of being the woman who wasn't quite good enough for anyone's first choice, she was the woman brave enough to choose love over safety? What if instead of running toward a solitary future in Edinburgh, she was running away from the first person who'd ever truly seen her? Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Morrison. "Looking forward to meeting you tomorrow. I've arranged for someone to collect you at Waverley Station." Margaret stared at the message, imagining the life waiting for her in Scotland. Neat, organized, predictable. A position of respect in a beautiful city, surrounded by books and academic colleagues who would appreciate her expertise. It was everything she'd thought she wanted. But it wasn't everything she actually wanted. The realization hit her like cold water. She was making the same mistake Oliver had made with Harriet, choosing what looked right on paper over what felt right in her heart. She was letting fear masquerade as practicality, running away from the possibility of rejection, rather than toward the possibility of joy. Margaret thought about the evening they'd spent in the library, sharing truths they'd never spoken aloud. About dancing with him at the gala, feeling for the first time that her awkwardness might be endearing rather than embarrassing. About the way he'd looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, not with the polite interest of someone fulfilling an obligation, but with genuine fondness and growing affection. The train began to slow as they approached Bristol Temple Meads. Margaret made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She stood up, grabbed her suitcase from the overhead compartment, and pushed through the carriage toward the doors. "Excuse me, miss," the conductor called. "This train continues to Edinburgh." "I know," Margaret replied, stepping onto the platform as the doors began to close. "But I'm not going to Edinburgh anymore." The next train back to Bath didn't leave for 45 minutes. Margaret sat in the Bristol Station cafe, nursing a cup of tea and composing a text message to Dr. Morrison, apologetic but firm, explaining that unexpected circumstances had made it impossible for her to accept the position after all. Then she turned off her phone and waited for the train that would take her back to Bath, back to uncertainty, back to the most important conversation of her life. She had no idea if Oliver would still be waiting at the Copper Kettle. She had no guarantees that choosing love over safety would end in anything other than heartbreak. But for the first time in her life, Margaret Taylor was brave enough to find out what happened when she stopped writing herself as a minor character and claimed the starring role in her own story. The train back to Bath pulled into the station at 4:17 p.m., exactly 23 minutes after Oliver's daily vigil was supposed to end. Margaret ran through the streets of the city she'd thought she was leaving forever, her suitcase bumping against her legs, her heart hammering with hope and terror. She turned the corner onto the street where the Copper Kettle waited and saw him through the window, still there, still waiting, a cold cup of tea on the table in front of him and resignation beginning to settle in his shoulders. Margaret pushed through the cafe door, breathless and travel-worn, and more certain than she'd ever been of anything in her life. Chapter 12. Return to the cafe. Oliver looked up from his untouched cup of tea, and Margaret watched a sequence of emotions flash across his face. Surprise, hope, disbelief, and finally, a smile so radiant it made her knees weak. "You came back," he said softly, rising from his chair with the careful movements of someone afraid this might be a mirage. "We got on the train," Margaret replied, suddenly aware that she was still breathing hard from her run through Bath's winding streets. I actually got on the train to Edinburgh. His face fell slightly. But you're here. But I'm here. She set down her suitcase and took a step closer to him. I got as far as Bristol before I realized I was making the biggest mistake of my life. The cafe around them seemed to fade away. The other patrons, the gentle clatter of cups and conversation, even the familiar comfort of the space where their story had begun. There was only Oliver, looking at her like she was something precious and fragile that he was afraid to reach for. "Margaret," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Let me say this first," she interrupted. "Before I lose my courage, I've spent my entire life choosing safety over possibility, choosing what looked sensible instead of what felt right. I was about to do it again, run away to a job that would be perfectly fine, with a life that would be perfectly adequate." She took another step closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "But perfectly adequate isn't enough anymore. Not after knowing what it feels like to be understood by someone, to be seen exactly as I am, and wanted anyway. Not after discovering that love doesn't have to be a performance or an improvement project." Oliver's hands were trembling slightly as he reached for her. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that I don't want to be alone anymore, even though being alone has kept me safe." Margaret's voice grew stronger, more certain with each word. "I'm saying that I want to build something real with you, even though real things can break. I'm saying that I love you, Oliver Blake, and I'm finally brave enough to risk everything for the possibility of something extraordinary." The words hung between them like a bridge finally completed after months of careful construction. Oliver's face crumpled with relief and joy, and something that looked like disbelief that this moment was actually happening. "I love you too," he whispered, his hands finally finding her face, cradling it like she was made of spun glass. "I've loved you since that first afternoon when you talked about medieval manuscripts with such passion that you forgot to be nervous. I've loved you through every moment of our ridiculous charade and every conversation where we stopped pretending. Even when I was running away. Especially when you were running away, because I understood why you needed to, because I was doing the same thing." His thumb traced along her cheekbone. "But I don't want to run anymore. I want to stay right here in this imperfect, complicated, gloriously real life with you." Margaret rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and tentative at first, then with growing certainty as his arms came around her, holding her close. It was nothing like their careful performance at the gala, no audience to convince, no role to play. Just two people who'd found their way to each other through all the stories they'd told themselves about who they were and what they deserved. When they finally broke apart, Oliver rested his forehead against hers. "What about Edinburgh?" he asked. "Your dream job?" "Edinburgh will have to find another librarian," Margaret replied with a smile. "I've just discovered that my real dream isn't about books or career advancement. It's about building a life with someone who thinks my love of medieval poetry is charming instead of strange." "It is charming, extraordinarily so." Oliver's smile was soft and wondering. "Though I should warn you, dating me for real is considerably less glamorous than our pretense. I really do work absurd hours, and I have strong opinions about Georgian architecture that most people find tedious. And I really do prefer quiet evenings with books to social events, and I know more about 14th century illuminated manuscripts than anyone has a right to." Margaret laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "We're quite a pair." "We're perfect," Oliver said firmly. "Perfectly imperfect and absolutely right for each other." Around them, the cafe continued its gentle bustle, other people's conversations weaving around their quiet celebration. But for Margaret and Oliver, there was only this moment, the end of pretending and the beginning of something gloriously, messily, wonderfully real. "So," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from him, "what happens now?" Oliver reached for her hand across the small table. Now we write the rest of our story together. No scripts, no performance, just us figuring out how to be happy." "I'd like that," Margaret replied, intertwining their fingers. "Though I should probably call my mother and explain why my boyfriend is suddenly real again." Oliver laughed, the sound rich with joy and possibility. "I'll help you practice what to say. After all, I've had some experience with playing the part of your devoted boyfriend." "Just don't expect me to make it easy," Margaret warned with a grin. "I'm thoroughly done with easy." "Good," Oliver replied, bringing her hand to his lips for a soft kiss. "So am I." Chapter 13. Without Pretense. 3 weeks later, Margaret found herself back at the Copper Kettle, but everything had changed. She sat across from Oliver at the same table where their charade had begun, but now his hand rested openly on hers, and the smiles they exchanged were entirely genuine. No performance, no audience to convince, just two people who'd discovered that the best relationships were built on truth rather than pretense. "Your mother seems to be adjusting well to the reality of us," Oliver observed, stirring his tea with the languid contentment of someone who no longer needed to be anywhere else. "She's thrilled that I'm finally settling down with someone suitable," Margaret replied with air quotes and a fond smile. "Though I think she's slightly disappointed that our relationship is less dramatic now that it's real. She keeps asking when we're getting married, as if love follows a predetermined timeline." "And what do you tell her?" "That we're taking it one day at a time, that some of the best stories unfold slowly." Margaret squeezed his hand. "That we're in no hurry to rush towards some imaginary finish line when we're enjoying the journey so much." It was true. The past 3 weeks had been a revelation in ordinary happiness. Oliver had been right about the difference between performance and reality. Their actual relationship was quieter than their pretense had been, but infinitely richer. They spent evenings in comfortable silence, she reading in the armchair while he sketched architectural details at the kitchen table. They discovered shared preferences for Sunday morning markets and independent films. They argued amicably about book recommendations and the proper way to make tea. Most surprisingly to Margaret, they talked, really talked, in ways she'd never managed with previous boyfriends, who'd seemed more interested in the idea of her than in understanding who she actually was. Oliver listened when she explained the historical significance of manuscript illumination with the same attention he gave to her concerns about her mother's expectations. He shared his frustrations about city planning committees and his dreams of designing buildings that would weather centuries with equal openness. "I have something for you," Oliver said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He produced a small wrapped package with the slightly nervous air of someone giving a gift that mattered. Margaret unwrapped it carefully to reveal a leather-bound notebook, beautiful but not ostentatious, with her initials embossed in gold on the cover. "It's for your writing," Oliver explained. "I thought, well, you're so gifted at understanding other people's stories. Perhaps it's time you wrote some of your own." Margaret ran her fingers over the smooth leather, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Oliver, this is beautiful, but I'm not really a writer." "You are, though. Every time you explain a historical period or describe a manuscript, you're telling stories. Every letter you write, every insight you share about the past, those are stories too." His eyes were warm with conviction. "I think you have stories in you that the world needs to hear." "What kind of stories?" "I don't know. Love stories, maybe? Stories about people who think they're not good enough for happiness and then discover they were wrong." Oliver's smile was teasing but tender. "Stories about fake relationships that become real ones?" Margaret laughed, opening the notebook to the first pristine page. "That might be too unbelievable for fiction." "The best love stories usually are." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Bath's residents hurry past the window in their eternal dance of daily life. Margaret thought about all the stories contained in the old city's walls, centuries of human joy and sorrow, hope and disappointment, love found and lost, and found again. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you wrote in your letter, about there being space in my story for you. And I think I had it backwards. I kept thinking about my life as this small, predetermined story where I was barely the supporting character. But maybe the story I was telling myself was the wrong one entirely." She looked up at him, seeing her own wonder reflected in his expression. "Maybe I was always the heroine of my own story. I just didn't recognize it because it didn't look like everyone else's." Oliver leaned across the small table and kissed her forehead gently. "I think that's exactly right, and for what it's worth, you're definitely the heroine of mine. Even though I'm terribly awkward at parties, and I know more about dead poets than living people, and I still can't dance properly, especially because of all those things, though I should mention, I've been taking dance lessons." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You have not." "I absolutely have. Mrs. Patterson from the library recommended an instructor. I thought perhaps you might let me redeem myself from that disastrous waltz at the gala." "It wasn't disastrous," Margaret protested, though she was smiling. "It was revelatory." "In what way?" "It was the moment I realized that pretending with you felt more real than being genuine with anyone else had ever felt." Oliver reached for both her hands, holding them firmly across the table. "No more pretending," he said seriously. "Promise me. Whatever comes next, meeting each other's friends, navigating your mother's expectations, figuring out our future, we do it as ourselves. Messy, imperfect, real." "I promise," Margaret replied without hesitation. "Though you should know, the real me is going to want to discuss medieval poetry over dinner sometimes. And the real me is going to want to explain why Gothic revival architecture was a mistake. I think we can work with that." Margaret opened her new notebook and wrote the date at the top of the first page, then added, "Chapter 1, the day we stopped pretending." She looked up to find Oliver watching her with an expression of such pure affection that her breath caught. "What?" she asked. "Nothing, everything. I'm just happy." He shook his head wonderfully. "Genuinely, completely happy. I'd forgotten what that felt like." Margaret set down her pen and reached for his hand again. "Me too. For the first time in my life, me too." Outside, Bath's eternal stones witnessed another small miracle of human connection, another story written in the margins of ordinary days. And inside the copper kettle, two people who'd learned to love themselves enough to risk loving each other sat planning a future built on the radical foundation of acceptance, honesty, and the faith that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the courage to stop pretending and start living. Epilogue: The book in the window. 6 months later. The autumn light filtering through the windows of Bartlett Street Books cast everything in shades of gold and amber, making the dust motes dance like tiny celebrations in the air. Margaret stood before the shop's main display window, staring at the small stack of books bearing her name on the spine. The Boyfriend in the Cafe, A Bath Love Story, by Margaret Taylor. "It's surreal seeing it there," she murmured, unconsciously leaning into Oliver's warmth as he stepped up beside her. "It's perfect," he replied, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Though I still think you were too kind to me in Chapter 7. I was considerably more of an idiot than your narrator suggests." "Literary license," Margaret said with a grin. "Besides, the story needed a properly reformed hero. Readers expect character growth." The bookshop owner, Mr. Hartwell, emerged from behind the counter with the satisfied expression of someone witnessing a small miracle. "Third printing already ordered," he announced proudly. "Haven't seen local interest like this since, well, ever, actually. People can't seem to get enough of your love story." Margaret still felt a flutter of disbelief when anyone called it her love story. Not just the book, but the life she and Oliver had built together. The small flat they'd found near the Royal Crescent, with its view of Bath's rolling hills and enough bookshelves to satisfy even her extensive collection. The quiet rhythms they'd established, morning coffee while she wrote and he sketched. Evening walks through the city's ancient streets, weekend trips to explore other historic towns where she could research and he could photograph architectural details. "The Bath Chronicle wants to do a feature," Oliver mentioned casually. "About the book, about us, something about local love stories in Georgian settings." "Absolutely not," Margaret replied immediately. "I've had quite enough of public performance for one lifetime." "I told them you'd say that." Oliver's laugh rumbled against her back. "But I also mentioned that you might consider it if they focused more on Bath's literary history and less on our personal lives." Margaret turned in his arms, studying his face. "You know me too well." "I should hope so. It's been my favorite subject of study for the past 8 months." The bell above the shop door chimed, and Lady Evelyn swept in with her usual theatrical flair, followed by Mrs. Ashworth and 2 other women Margaret recognized from various Bath social events. "There she is," Lady Evelyn announced, as if Margaret might have been hiding. "My daughter, the published author. Mrs. Pemberton simply insisted on meeting you after reading your book." Margaret felt the familiar flutter of social anxiety, but Oliver's steady presence at her side kept her grounded. She'd learned, over these months of happiness, that she could navigate these interactions without losing herself in them. "It's lovely to meet you," Margaret said genuinely to Mrs. Pemberton, a woman she'd only ever seen from across crowded rooms. "I hope you enjoyed the story." "Enjoyed it? My dear girl, I devoured it in one sitting." Mrs. Pemberton clasped Margaret's hands with surprising warmth. "Such a refreshing change from those dreadful books where everyone's shouting about their feelings. Your characters actually talk to each other like civilized people." "They do argue about architecture and medieval poetry quite a bit," Margaret admitted. "As they should. Passion for one's interests is terribly attractive. Mr. Blake, you must be very proud." Oliver smiled, that smile that still made Margaret's heart skip. "Every day," he said simply. After the small crowd of admirers had purchased their copies and departed with promises to recommend the book to everyone they knew, Margaret and Oliver found themselves alone in the shop's quiet atmosphere. "I have something for you," Margaret said, pulling a small wrapped package from her purse. "Publication day gift." Oliver unwrapped it to reveal a vintage brass compass, its face etched with intricate details. "It's beautiful," he said, running his thumb over the smooth metal. "But what's it for?" "Look at the inscription." He turned it over to read the engraving on the back. "For O.B. No more getting lost. All my love, M." Oliver's expression softened with understanding. "Margaret, I know we don't need grand gestures or dramatic declarations," she said, suddenly nervous despite months of certainty about them. "But I wanted you to have something that says you'll always have a home base with me, that no matter where your work takes you or how far you travel for projects, there's always a place to return to. Are you—" Oliver's voice was carefully controlled. "Are you asking me to move in with you? Officially. I'm asking you to build a life with me, officially, permanently. I'm asking you to stop keeping your toothbrush in the guest bathroom and your clothes in a separate drawer, like you're still waiting for permission to stay." Oliver set the compass carefully on the counter and cupped her face in his hands. "Margaret Taylor, are you proposing to me?" "I'm proposing that we stop pretending this is temporary," she replied, her heart hammering but her voice steady. "I'm proposing that we acknowledge what we both already know, that this is it for us. That we've found each other, and we're not letting go." "That," Oliver said, kissing her softly, "sounds like the best proposal I've ever heard. Is that a yes?" "That's a yes to everything. Moving in together, building something permanent, acknowledging that this is forever." He rested his forehead against hers. "Though I reserve the right to do the official proposing when the time comes, I have my pride, you know." Margaret laughed, feeling light and happy and more certain than she'd ever been of anything. "I wouldn't dream of stealing that moment from you." They stood there in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by thousands of stories, but finally, completely absorbed in writing their own. Outside, Bath continued its ancient dance of seasons and centuries. indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in its embrace. But inside the bookshop, two people who'd learned that love didn't require performance held each other and planned a future built on the radical foundation of being exactly who they were. Margaret picked up her published book, running her fingers over the cover one more time. On the dedication page, in simple black type, were the words, "For Oliver, who taught me that the best love stories begin with the courage to be real." She'd written their story, but they were still living it, still discovering new chapters every day. And for the first time in her carefully ordered life, Margaret Taylor was excited to see what came next. So, would you have the courage to do the same thing she did? A lie can change everything, or reveal what your heart already knew. Now tell me, at what point in this story gave you goosebumps? Leave a comment, I want to hear your opinion, and tell me which country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has reached. Like, share with someone who will be moved. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next breathtaking twist.